spectrum of loss and a variety of ways to get through it. I want to remind you that if you have questions, to keep them short so that other people have a chance to share. And please let everyone know that you are being recorded, so there will be an audio recording made here. And we ask you to listen with an open mind and participate in a safe, shared personal information. Take the learning with you when people share in that way. And if there's someone needs some additional help, we have mental health professionals that will come and help you. You can go to the front desk and ask for help, and we welcome you. And I want to introduce you to our speaker, who is Stephanie Larson, an MSW, LICSW, and LCSW. She's a psychotherapist who has helped many clients work through a variety of losses. Stephanie will draw from both her personal and her professional experiences in this clinically informed yet candid discussion on grief and loss. She will normalize grief as a normal part of the grief cycle, of the life cycle, define different types of loss, and offer ways to support yourself and others through the grief process by engaging in empathy and patience while letting go of unrealistic or societal expectations. Let's give a warm welcome to Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Welcome. Thank you for being here on this beautiful afternoon. Probably tempting to go enjoy this last little bit of warmth before we know what happens in our Minnesota winters, but I really appreciate you being here for this important topic. It's something I'm quite passionate about. I am a therapist at Jewish Family Service of St. Paul, as well as work in a private practice that I own in Wisconsin a couple of days a week. And what brought me into this work was professional experience as well as personal experience, and so you'll see those two things threading together through my talk. I will ask for this to be mild to moderately interactive. If you were here this morning with Kathy's opening keynote, which I thought was wonderful, I was watching thinking, oh, Kathy, you set the stage for me, thank you. The way that she was talking through going into our bodies, we'll do a little bit of that here today. Not necessarily with specific practice exercises, but really looking inward, checking in with what you're noticing with yourself. And so with that said, if you could just kind of pay attention to respect yourself and anything that might come up while we're talking today, and remembering that others in the room too are bringing in their own experiences, and who knows, today we might have someone who is in a very raw and fresh grief swell. We might have something that happened 20 to 40 years ago that we're remembering, and we might just be here for supporting others. So with that said, would it be okay if I just do a quick show of hands? Who is here for a professional reason? Thank you. And you might overlap here. Personal? Yeah, good. And personal meaning, you don't have to share if you don't want to, by the way. Working through something your own for yourself right now, if you wouldn't mind. And then trying to support someone else who that you care for. Okay, good. So I think the evidence by show of hands in the room shows that we are all experiencing some form of grief in our life. And so that's the first thing that I say. In grad school, I joked with my peers that I did a lot of talks in my research on end of life and grief, and they kind of like joked with me when it was my turn to present my research. They're like, oh, Steph's here, she's gonna talk about that thing again. And I would just get to the point where I said, here's the thing though, there's not a lot I can guarantee you in this world, but what I can guarantee you is you will deal with some sort of grief. You will lose something, someone at some point. And so that's why I think it's really, really important for us to chat about this. So if you could do our first little experiential exercise here and just take a moment to reflect inward of why am I here in this room right now, listening to someone speak about grief. because that is the best answer, because yes, thank you. Thank you. So I have a background of working in home health and hospice, medical social work, dialysis before doing the world of psychotherapy. In my psychotherapy, I have a deep niche focus in trauma, developmental trauma, grief, caregiver fatigue, life adjustment, and relationship strain. Sometimes that relationship strain is with spouse, sometimes it is with children, sometimes it is with those we caregive for, and a lot of times it is from an attachment-based model of the caregivers who were to be guiding us as we were growing through our developmental years. So I share that to let you know that that is the lens I come into this talk with. I also come into this with a lot of personal experience at what I would say young age with death of person. And in about a 13-month time span, I believe it was. It's a little fuzzy because grief does that to our brain, makes things fuzzy, really fuzzy sometimes. I had a massive swell of losses of people who were very important to me, one of them being a traumatic death of my only sibling, as well as the death of my grandparents, whom I was very close with, and aunts and uncles, all in the same family system. And so there was a lot to work through. I was in my young 20s, and so I got lessons in grief very quick, very hard, very fast. And if we think back to what Kathy was talking about this morning, trauma is too hard, too fast, too much all at once. And so that's that. And my work in hospice, I really saw people modeling the most compassionate, holistic, empathetic care for our clients that I career shifted and thought, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be there for those people in the way that others in my personal life and professional life were there for me. So, yes. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. He's noting on intergenerational trauma, and I would include in that there's a lot of developmental trauma. There's research that shows that those of us who have experienced some developmental trauma are actually about 9 times more sensitive to difficult things. And so I don't know if that validates for you. Yeah, thanks. Okay. Here's our objectives for today. I'm not going to read through them because I think they're well enough said in the program description, and that's why you showed up today. So we're going to go through some definitions, a little bit fast and furious here so we can hopefully keep time for discussion at the end. Loss. I'd like you to think of loss as an event. Often when we think of loss, our mind first goes to person. That's the most common type of loss we are accustomed to as humans. But loss is the absence of an important person, place, or thing. And I believe it was Webster's definition that said the fact or process of losing something or someone. Keeping in mind, loss does not have to be tangible. And that's going to help us as we talk about different types of grief and different ways that we mourn. So loss in the world of grief is an event that causes an emotional disruption for us, but it is not necessarily tangible. Here are a bunch of common types of loss. Death, or tangible loss, which is what we're very accustomed to, is what's most recognized by us, by others. It's also then usually one of the most common types of loss that we are supported through. And so I have a list here. If anyone over here on the tangible side of loss has other examples, because the list could have been hundreds of items long. Anyone with just a 1-word or 2-word answer that sees something that might be missing from that right-hand side? Yeah. Family home? Yeah, fires. We think of the flooding and hurricanes that have been going on recently. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah, that's right. Selling of a family home after someone passes, yeah. A form of secondary loss as well, which we'll get into. And I want to keep in mind that on the other side of our slide here are psychological or intangible losses. So ideas, expectations, something you can think of is maybe as a child, well, I remember wanting to be a veterinarian. Fortunately, I didn't feel loss in that, but if that was something I had really thought about my entire life and didn't get to do it, that could be an intangible loss. Loss of our rights. That's a big one that often is unseen. Our identity and role, if we think of being caregivers, being a caregiver, especially if you're caregiving for someone throughout their entire life, I think of adults who have children with disabilities. Once that person no longer needs to be caregiven for, your entire identity can be lost because you may have invested all of your life into caring for that person. Again, natural disasters. Some types of loss can go into both categories where there is something tangible you could show, I could put it in a picture or tell you about it, and it might also have some intangibility to it. Any other intangible losses that are popping up for folks out there that feel really important? Yeah. Relatives? Relevance. Yes. The pertinence of something. Is that what you're, yeah. Okay. Yeah. To what? I'm sorry? Be partnered. Yeah. Right. The idea of being partnered and never having been able to do that. Yeah, absolutely. And so in the center, I want to point out that there can be ambiguous loss in either direction, and there's tons of other kinds of loss. We're just going to talk about some of the highlighted ones here today. But ambiguous loss occurs without closure or clear understanding. It lacks resolution, verification, or certainty, and it leaves the bereaved searching for answers. So if we think of missing persons, that is a really great example of ambiguous loss. Tremendous grief burden to bear. And so primary versus secondary, thank you for leading into this. We might lose a parent and then have to sell the family home later. So the primary loss would be loss of parent. The secondary loss is what is the outcome of that primary loss. So here's a slide that really kind of speaks to spousal loss. They're not naming it here, but as I look at this, I see it that way, that in the center circle there, the primary loss is a loss of person. And if you look to the next layer of circles, in relation to that loss of person, we might have lost income. We might have lost one of our primary support systems. We might have lost financial security, intimacy, and then it goes out another layer. I'll try to read some of those for you since it's not quite clear. Loss of home. So you didn't know you were a scholar before you came to this, did you? Loss of job, loss of working memory, a lot of ambiguity in working memory if we think about Alzheimer's, dementia, where we start to lose what we knew of a person before they are physically gone from us. Mourning is the action of what we do with our grief. So, often culturally influenced, spiritually influenced. It's the traditions, the norms, the process. It is the outward expression of our grief. Anything that you can think of, this is a bit of an exercise to do with yourself. In the cultural norms that you're accustomed to, what types of expressions of mourning have been comforting to you or discomforting. Because my goal for you in this talk is that you can start to assess what you're doing with your grief when it happens, and so that you can decide if that's something you want to participate in the next time you have a grief event. Sometimes we get into the mundane, not mundane, that's not a great word. We just fall into patterns. We get into patterns, and we might be all of a sudden carrying out an action that we maybe are societally expected to do and catch ourselves thinking, why am I doing this? I will share with you, I remember saying to family members, I'm not sure which person loss it was. I think it was a loss of my grandmother. Sitting at the table with my aunts and whomever else was there writing out thank you notes, which I think is a lovely thing to do. And in my grief, I was so angry. I said, this is the stupidest tradition that anyone ever started, is to ask a bereaved family to sit and write out thank you notes. So, soapbox, I'll step off. But just think about the things that you do in your morning that are really important. Because there's things that are equally as important as they are frustrating. And you get to decide. That's what we're in an age now where we get to decide what we want to do with that. Some people have gone by way, taking my thank you note example, of putting a nice note in the newspaper, just letting everyone know, like, thank you. But when people are in a grief moment, I think that we as the supporters, if it's not our grief, but we're an external layer as a supporter, it's really important to give those people permission to not follow through with every single societal or cultural expectation, just to make who does that make feel better? So grief is the emotional experience that is the result of a loss. It's what we feel. It's not necessarily what we're doing. Grieving can become an act of mourning, but it is what we feel inside our being. Defined as deep sorrow, especially caused by someone's death. Again, grief is typically recognized as the loss of a person. And if we only recognize grief in association to loss of person, we are doing the people we care about a bit of an injustice, because it can disregard grief that is associated with other types of losses. And I really enjoy this picture here from Abandoned Beautiful World. That grief is described as a hole ripped through the very fabric of your being. There is a poem I'd like to read with this. I just want to check my time. We're good. So looking at this picture, it says, this is what grief is. A hole ripped through the very fabric of your being. The hole eventually heals along the jagged edges that remain. It may even shrink in size, but the hole will always be there. A piece of you always missing. For where there is deep grief, there was great love. Don't be ashamed of your grief. Don't judge it. Don't suppress it. Don't rush it. Rather, acknowledge it. Lean into it. Listen to it. Feel it. Sit with it. Sit with the pain and remember the love. This is where the healing will begin. Okay. Any reflections that feel really important right now from the group? I'll just have you take an inward look, thinking about any type of grief you had that was important, and just kind of thinking about what that poem said for you in relation to the type of grief you were experiencing and loss. Yeah. What is good grief? Good morning. Yeah. What helps you work through? Is that what you're trying to ask?
What's the right way?
Yeah, the right way. I'm going to give you an answer that might make you want to punch me in the face right now. The right way is your way. And that is really the basis of this talk, is that we fall into these cultural norms that tell us, and we're getting there, so hopefully this will validate what you're experiencing. Do it this way, act like a robot, do like this, there's a prescription, there's a recipe, and all of a sudden you will feel better. That's just simply not the truth. That is an untruth that we've been told, and I think it comes from a place of good intention. And it's because when we're in pain, other people want to help us. They want to help us feel better. And so it's like, well, just do this and you'll feel better. Actually, we don't know that. Maybe what would sound better is to say, try this, see if it feels better. Yeah. Yes? You guys are so ahead of me on the slide. Here, come on up. No, I'm teased. But yes, you're absolutely right. What Steve said was people get a little carried away.
And then good example, Queen Victoria. I mean, after her husband died for almost 40 years, she wore black, except her diamond jubilee, she wore white. But she mourned,
Queen Victoria?
and then she left. And then she warned everybody, mourn for the rest of her life.
Yeah.
And for a while, she didn't even rule. She was in hiding, and then she made her children's lives miserable.
So she wasn't processing. Mourning, but not processing. Yeah. Yeah.
Of course, maybe back then they didn't have stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a couple centuries ago, so that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about types of grief. So normal grief, this is where I kind of, in my bio or in the program write-up, I said we're going to talk candidly. I'm a pretty straightforward, candid person, as you can tell. Normal grief, by definition, in the world of psychology, says that it lasts 6 months to 2 years. I'm not sure about that, but again, going back to your question, the best way through grief is your way, and if it takes 5 years, it takes 5. If it takes 5 minutes, great. That's wonderful. And it follows the social, cultural, and religious or spiritual norms. Delayed grief has an onset of our grieving post the loss event. So the event happens, and maybe there's a little bit of time before that you start to grieve. Some good examples of this is, first of all, maybe life didn't let you grieve because the next crisis came up or the next thing happened. A lot of people in the military experience delayed grief when they're on active duty because there's no communication with family, so they might find out about something after they get home or when they're on leave, and so their grief is delayed, and the people in their systems have had time to process, and it's like they're just finding out right now. That can be very shocking to the system. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Steve's referencing a combat soldier being in combat, and if you're fighting a war, you don't have time to stop and grieve that your fellows might. Yeah, that's right. Anticipatory grief is the felt sense and process prior. We can expect the loss happening. One more mild example of this is maybe when we're thinking of our children getting to graduation age, and maybe during that senior year we start to think, oh my gosh, all the things, and that's grief because I would call that great grief maybe because our kids are getting to the point of what they should be doing developmentally, which is leaving the nest. However, there's grief in it still. And for some people it is really deep grief because for a variety of reasons. Again, Alzheimer's or dementia, illness are in this anticipatory grief. And disenfranchised grief is a really important area to think about. Under this category, I would put something as maybe what might seem minor as getting fired. There's a lot of shame in that. People, well, you lost your job, it's your fault. Well, there's grief in that. It's a loss. It doesn't matter if it's someone's fault. Other things in this category might be assault because there's a lot of stigma around talking about assault, and so we don't want to talk with victims about what happened to them, so it becomes disenfranchised. Miscarriage and even role in your family can be kind of disenfranchised depending on family systems, but that's a different, family systems is a different talk for another day. I'm sorry? There certainly could be. Yeah, absolutely. Grief with an abortion decision. Yep, absolutely. No, they can overlap. That's a great question. So we can have one loss event that can have different types of grief associated with it. Great question. Yep. Oh, yes. Her question was, are these mutually exclusive, these types of grief? And the answer was, yeah, you could have one loss event that falls into multiple categories of how it's falling upon your system and how you feel. I wanted to touch briefly in our talk that just in 2022, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what we use in the psychotherapy world for assigning a diagnosis, has its first grief disorder, which is called prolonged grief disorder. Prior to that, we as professionals treating people under a billable hour maybe would use adjustment disorder, sometimes anxiety, sometimes depression. It depends on what symptomology is popping up for you. And there's a little, as this diagnosis was being put into the DSM, there was a little bit of controversy around it amongst professionals, that being because it puts some time constraints around things. And so the first one being that one criteria would be that if your grief is prolonged, greater than 12 months if you're an adult, or more than 6 months if you're a child, that might be complicated grief. Well, again, one of the things that I'd like to drive home with you all today is that if we could just erase all expectations around timelines as associated with grief, we might be sitting in a better place of being able to support each other. And so, again, this is debatable. I see both sides of the argument, and so I'll try to touch on some of those. But looking through these criteria that are here, saying that the grief is persistent most of the days, including an intense longing for a person and a preoccupation with thoughts or memories of the deceased. I have an area of emphasis. One of my niches is working with older adults. I can tell you I work with countless numbers of people who have been partnered, and their partner of 40, 60, maybe even 70 years passes, and I don't know how someone can bypass that first criteria of not deeply longing for their partner after really almost their entire life they've lived with them. So again, I can see both sides of this. There are other criteria here that you're probably reading through as I'm talking. And in order to meet the criteria for this, you have to have a certain number of these bullet points here. And so what I see in this debate about this diagnosis being added to the manual is that there are some pros, because if this diagnosis allows you to receive professional help under a billable model and use your insurance, so be it. Then if you qualify for complicated grief, great. It's an access to services that maybe wouldn't have been there before, especially if a professional was using an adjustment disorder, which primarily we don't want to use for much more than 12 months. The cons is, I'll give a little bit of my opinion here, is that, well, then we're tied into the insurance systems, and I don't like to pathologize everything. A pro is that it can provide some validation for what you're experiencing, to be like, oh my goodness, maybe the people around me seem as if they're working through this grief a little bit easier than I am. Oh, okay, there's actually something that is telling me that this is just harder for me than others, and so I'm going to go seek professional help about it. And it does recognize or differentiate things outside of depression or outside of anxiety or outside of another type of diagnosis. Yes, I see a hand. That's a little bit of the debate, right? So she was asking, per this criteria, does there have to be death of a person in order to qualify as having complex or complicated grief? I believe, as the way I interpret the DSM, that is what they're saying. And that's a little bit of my talk here today about grief is not just about losing a human. So it's debatable. Okay. That is grief, yep. Okay, that's right. Grief of divorce or a marriage ending, he was saying. Trying to remember to repeat so that we can hear it on the recording here today. Okay. So, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross studied death and dying and then partnered with David Kessler and studied grief and grieving. I have some books up here for later. Through her research, she proposed that these are the main areas of the grief process. We have a loss event, there's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You have a resolution, and 12 months post the loss event, it's done. Now, it wasn't Kubler-Ross's intention for it to be a linear, clear-cut, nice and tidy package. She was simply saying, these are the most common symptoms and experiences that I am witnessing in folks who are dying or experiencing grief. And so as a culture, again, I believe where this kind of got put into this neat little timeline is that it makes us feel good if we can tell others, oh, now you're in the anger stage. You'll go to this next. And then I'm going to march you along this way. I have some laughter in the crowd here. And then you're going to go here, and you're going to go here. And then it's going to be done, and we're all going to feel better, right? No, I really don't think that was Kubler-Ross's intention at all. In fact, I think she speaks about it in some of the books. But this is just kind of the cultural basic norm, especially here in the Midwest, that we are given by the spoonfuls about our grief. Again, the whole point of this talk is let's test this a little bit. So over here, this is another person's model of the stages of grief in that big bowl of a U curve there. All sorts of things are going on in there: shock, numbness, disorganization, loneliness, isolation, and then we get to the point where we are re-entering into the world in the new way that we know it, and we're developing new identities, strengths, relationships. But again, it is not a simple little curve like this. And what it actually looks like is that nest of a mess. And so if you can walk away with another thing today, that being just knowing that grief will go where grief goes, and the less we try to control it, I believe, from the work that I've done myself and the work I've done with others, the less we can try to control it and just be with it, the easier we're going to get through the process. Question?
I know it's stated and you can't give it clear one way or the other.
Yeah.
But is there a general difference between the person who's dying's grief and the caregiver's or loved one's grief patterns?
Trying to think if I understand your question. Is there a general difference between the grief of a dying person versus that of
That is the ones, people surrounding them. Just in terms
the people surrounding them?
of stages that you might see.
No, I haven't seen that. I just think it's so unique. You know, when I worked in hospice, a lot of the clients I worked with were older adults, typically. And I will say that but it's not tried and true for every person, but part of the process about nearing end of life as an older adult is that sometimes if we've gotten through our developmental stages, and for those of you who are providers in the room thinking of Erickson's psychosocial crises, if we've kind of worked through each of those in our lives, acceptance of death seems to have a higher correlation to it. That doesn't mean that we are at our end of life and go, well, this is great. You know, it's going to be so unique for every single person. So I thought this quote was important, that people rush through grief because they see it as hanging on to loss, but grief is really hanging on to love, which is why you feel it. Grief is not linear. Grief is not prescriptive. Grief is not clean. So while I was working with a therapist on the multiple grief experience I was having in my early 20s, I did feel rushed. I felt hurried by the people around me to figure it out on my own and get back to life, because that works nicely for everyone. I was functioning, by the way, but maybe to not be driving down the street and see something and burst into tears. And at some point, I just came to this realization, and I don't know if I heard it somewhere or if my therapist told me, I'm not quite sure. This is where I got to. I didn't have to get over it. And I wasn't going to just get over it, but I could get through it, because I had other reasons that were still here to keep driving forward. That didn't mean it was going to be easy. That didn't mean it was going to be simple. But that's where I got to the point in the grieving process that I had a choice of what I was going to do with it. One of the stages of grief that's a little bit newer here, David Kessler, again, he had done all that work with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, is that he is suggesting that a sixth stage of grief is finding meaning. And so he says that meaning happens within the griever, not in the event. So if we lose someone to suicide, we're not going to probably find meaning in that. But if my loss is related to someone who completed suicide, I might be able to find meaning in that. He's not suggesting that this stage should be a bypass to all the pain and the work that happens in grief, but that it can be a cushion, that if we can make some meaning around our loss, it might feel different. And so an example of that I will give that's personal is that in the tragic loss of my brother, which was a rollover car accident, again, I decided, I'm actually kind of good at this helping others thing, so once I'm done being helped, I'm going to grow up and be a therapist, and I'm going to work through trauma with people. That's one of the ways I made meaning of it. That's not going to be the storyline for everybody. That's not what I'm proposing here. But how do you make meaning? I think of some people who have started organizations, fundraisers here in Minnesota. We're very familiar with the Wetterlings when Jacob Wetterling went missing, and how they gave their life's energy to helping that cause. And that's a way that they made meaning. Meaning doesn't have to be starting an organization. It doesn't have to be that grandiose. I just use those two as really good examples. He also, one of the most important things here is that he says that next to having an empathetic, supportive witnesser, making meaning might be one of the most important processes in the grieving process, or important parts of the grieving process. So this slide, I think, is really important, looking at circles of support. So if you look at the very center of this target, that is the loss event, and that is the people or things closest to that loss event. And if we think of in our layers, those who support us, in the outer layers are the people who aren't as affected by the loss. An example I give in this is that a very dear friend of mine, when her grandmother was dying on hospice, she was like a mother to her. And I grew up on their farm. I loved her grandmother. Very important to me. But I was in the outer layers of those circles. It was not my loss event. It was not my grandmother. And so I was able to bring more comfort into this family system than we would expect comfort coming from those closest to the center of the circle. The other goal is that if you can realize who's in your circles of support, when you're in the center, you can kind of look outward for that help. But it takes a really mindful practice to understand who is where on these circles, on these layers. And that's why I think part of pre-grief work, knowing that we're all going to go through this at some point in our life, is to think about, oh, in this hypothetical situation, who are my people out in those outer layers? Or who are my resources? What are my resources in those layers so that I can draw upon those, instead of looking right next to the person that also lost their grandmother. It doesn't mean you can't have mutual support in those inner layers, but when you're both down and out, where do you go? What do you do with that? So, big question. How do I grieve? How do I get through this? How do I do it? Not prescriptive. Again, nothing on here is probably going to be all that surprising to you. It's really a reinforcement and some throwing out there of ideas of what you can do when you are dealing with grief. So this is the frame of supporting someone else through grief. If you could all take a second to think about a loss event and someone who is grieving, where it's not your loss event, and maybe you're in those outer layers of the circle, middle to outer layers, and thinking of these ideas as how you can bring support in to the loss. Time. I don't know how many times, I should have had someone doing a tally of how many times I said that in this talk. Allow time. No fixing, just offers. And so if we put ourselves, this might be what you were referencing, Steve, about people going a little bit over the top. It's not our job as a supporter to come in and fix it for others. Even myself as a trauma and grief therapist, I cannot fix the grief for my clients, but I can be there with them, I can witness them, I can offer some suggestions, and what they do with it will be their decision. So just really knowing it's not your job to fix, it's just your job to be there. Making meals, helping with chores, childcare. We're very depleted in our energy resources and thinking resources when we're going through grief. So if you can hop in and help somebody out, that's great. In the Midwest, I love that we share love with food. Remembering that there is the catchphrase of the real grieving starts when the last casserole dish goes home. Yeah, it's true. There's that first time frame when we're dealing with the loss of a person. And after a while, the rest of the world does have to go back to work. We have to function. We have to go back to our daily lives. And so remembering as a supporter that influx of support will dwindle. And depending on where you are in that circle, that's all the more reason to support more a little bit down the road. I actually have gotten into the practice of not even sending a sympathy card for at least a week or two. Get the person outside or out of the house, because when we are grieving, all we want to do is stay inside, typically. Checking in, calling, sending a card, texting. And if you do those things, allow for non-response. Again, it is not the people in the center of the target's job to make sure we feel good by responding to us. Respect boundaries. So if someone's gone through a trauma event or a really difficult thing like an assault, know the boundaries, right? Know what they might want. And if you don't know, ask, give permission, get permission from them. Silence is okay, giving hugs. Talk about the loved one or the event, again, being sensitive with boundaries and asking, do you want to talk about this? If they say no, that is their answer right now. Remind them to treat themselves as a best friend. Avoid labeling people or defining the loss for them, such as, oh, you feel like this right now. Again, going back to those stages of, or the stages of grief. You're angry, you're in the anger stage right now. People know how they feel. They might not be able to express it, but they know how they feel. Don't claim to know exactly how someone feels, rather ask, what is this like for you? And more importantly, what is this like for you right now? Because what I felt like 5 minutes ago might feel different than what I feel like this afternoon. That is grief. Support during the pitfalls. If you're closer to the middle inner part of that circle and you still identify as a supporter, then you will know when your people have pitfalls. I think of like my closest girlfriends. I know. If you're close with someone, you know. And so that's when you give a little extra love, a little extra something. Again, knowing where you are in the circle of support, I think that's really important. If I started work with someone just a few weeks ago and they have a loss event, I'm maybe not going to just go over on the weekend morning with coffee in my hands and knock on the door and say, let me in, because that's probably not respecting their boundaries. However, if it's my best friend, you're darn sure I'm going to do that because we know that about each other. She might not respond. She might be too fatigued or crying to do that, and I'm just going to show up. So helping with connecting folks to resources, and whether that be, I think of when we're doing end of life or final affairs planning for folks, maybe there needs to be some paperwork filled out. If you're tight with that person and close, ask, do you want me to help you fill out that paperwork? Do you want help with funeral planning? Okay. I could probably talk for another hour, but I know we're getting short on time here today, so I'm going to probably keep speeding through here. I liked this quote, talking about the people or the loss, again with permission from the griever. I saw someone today who mentioned you in our conversation. I never wanted that moment to end. Knowing others remember you always makes my heart smile. And so when we lose people or things, what's important is to not be alone in it. We want to be sure that the loss is not forgotten. And so that's what I think this quote shows. Here are some potentially destructive things that we can do when we are trying to support someone. Grief ranking is one of the biggest ones that's really prickly and scratchy for me. This might sound like, yeah, well, when I lost my mom. Grief halting is like, stop, don't cry, stop, don't bring that here. Because all that does is tell the person who's grieving is, I can't handle that with you. What might sound better is if you feel like if you can't handle that with someone, because that's okay, say, what could I do to help you find someone who can help you through this? But halting someone, it can be potentially destructive. Ignoring the loss, avoiding it, not talking about it at all, making assumptions, providing prescriptive plans, and adhering to these expectations, these stages of grief and timelines can be destructive. Here in how to support yourself through grief and loss, there's going to be some redundancy between the two. Again, allowing for time and pitfalls, drawing on your faith, spirituality, and community, whatever feels good, important, supportive, and authentic for you. Allowing for any emotion, even the good ones, even humor. Humor is actually one of my primary coping mechanisms. So if that's you and your people who know you know that that's what you appreciate, and you can get 3 minutes of laughter in a day when you are grieving, go for it. There's a lot of expectations around, oh, I shouldn't be enjoying myself right now, or I shouldn't be laughing because, oh, yes, I'm grieving. Our bodies need a minute to get away from the distress of it. Being very honest about what you're going through in your most trusted spaces. Continuing connection with the loss. And so I've had many clients ask me, am I crazy because I'm talking to my dad who's passed away? No, you're connecting with them. You miss them. You're longing for them. Sometimes it's wearing a piece of their clothing or a piece of their jewelry or looking at their picture or listening to a song that was important to you. There's plenty of ways, and there's nothing wrong with connecting with your losses. Taking breaks and distractions, treating yourself. For me, a good treat in a grief time is a cup of coffee with a friend. Counting the wins, listing 3 things you did today. So if you can recall ever yourself being in a really deep grief moment, some people I've had say to me, I can't even think of 3 things I did today. And I'll say, well, you're here talking to me, so you're breathing. You're here telling me a thought, so you're thinking, and you're here, so you got out of bed. That's 3 things, right? Sometimes we're thinking 3 things is, oh, I organized the pantry today. No, it doesn't have to be big things. Just count the little wins. Music, art, and other nonverbal expressions are really important in our grieving process because they can often articulate things that we do not have the words for. Try your very, very best not to judge the grieving process. David Kessler says that judgment demands punishment, and by that, either punishing yourself or the person you're judging. And the example he uses is that if you think of spouses who have lost a child and the 2 parents are grieving so differently, if we start judging the way each other are grieving, you're only going to punish your relationship. You're going to tell them you're not doing it right, or they're going to tell you, no, you're not doing it right. And so the judgment just really does not help. Making a support plan for yourself, stick with the basics. Nourishment, sleep, movement, daylight is important. When we are grieving, we want to cocoon into the darkness. Make sure you get some daylight. Tapping into those circles of support in your community. Being okay with asking for help and allowing for help. If someone says, can I do that? There is no shame in saying, yeah, cut my grass. That would be great. But we like to get up and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and tough through things, right? Find your 8. There's some research. By this it means there's research that shows just 8 minutes with someone who you trust and who can support you can provide immense amount of worth. And so thinking about who are the people or resources or community members or spiritual connections that in 8 minutes of time spent with them could help me out. Sometimes that is your best friend, sometimes it's your family, sometimes it's prayer. 8 minutes is all it takes. So figuring out, what are my 8? Is it 8 minutes of meditation or walking outside? Is it 8 minutes of a phone call with a best friend? And having a variety, because if they're all people, we might reach out and then, oh my goodness, that person was in a work meeting and they couldn't contact me then, right in that moment. But they'll get back to you if they're in your 8. They'll get back to you when they can. If needed, finding a cohesive support group or seeing a therapist. And this is one intervention I use with people. I recently had someone tell me, oh my gosh, Stephanie, I've used that over and over. So this is a person who lost their spouse. She was their caregiver through his Lewy body dementia and is now working with me on grief and loss. And she's a doer. She's a get up and a goer, and she doesn't have the energy for it right now. And so she's like, oh, I'm just not myself. I can't. And someone asked me to do this, and someone asked me to do this, and I said, all right, let's figure this out. So we need to assess the energy bank. So asking yourself these 3 questions when you are asked to do something while you are grieving. Number 1, is it aligned with my values, or does it meet a need? So if someone says, can I take you to get groceries? You might have 0 energy to get groceries. But if it meets a need, I might want to do it. If someone says, will you go out with me and pick out a shirt for the conference I'm speaking at this weekend? Might not be so important to you. Do you have the capacity to do it? Meaning energy, resources, time, all of that. And what is your return on investment? And I really encourage you to think about this 3rd question as not being selfish, but rather to be gentle with yourself, because when you're in the grieving process, you have to be very, very protective of your resources. Biologically, our bodies are worn out. We have limited energy bank. And so what is the return on investment? And so if it is going out with someone for a cup of coffee, you might return home feeling better. Okay, I'm going to speed through these next ones because of time. We did get started a little bit late here, so I'm sorry. Writing, storytelling, and conversations. Write about your grief and loss. There is research that shows that written word, whether it be song lyrics, poem, journaling, listening to song lyrics, is one of the best ways to actually process what we're going through. It is not strange. I think it's very clever to write a letter to the deceased or the source of loss. And you can even write from that person's perspective. So if my parent were to pass away, I might write a letter from my parents' perspective of what it's like to be without me. That can be very healing. Take on another's perspective of what this loss might have been for them. Sometimes that helps us work through things. Telling stories about people, that's one of my favorite ways of processing. I love stories about the people I'm missing. Learn other people's stories. Connect with someone in the outer layers of your circle or completely outside of your circle of support who's had a similar loss, because then you don't have to hold each other through that same loss, but you can relate with one another, and that can be really validating. Daily prayers, meditations can help us integrate things, and doing Thaniversary. Thaniversary is the anniversary of a death, memorial or honor events. One thing we like to do in our house is making the food of the person who's passed away on like holidays, making their favorite food so that they can be there with us in some sense. Another thing that a lot of my clients like to do is complete things that they weren't able to do with that person, so doing that in their honor or in their memory. Okay. One last check-in here with yourself. I'm going to say some things. This is going to put yourself back into, hopefully, a role of a supporter. If you're thinking of, what do I say to that person? And I'm going to just have you check in with your body on how these things feel inside your body when I say them for you. Some really great things to say and some really not so great things to say. I wish I had the right words, just know that I care. At least you lived a long time, many people die young. Oh, my favorite memory of that loved one is, she brought this upon herself. Ugh. I'm always just a phone call away. You're not over him yet. He's been dead for a while now. We all need help at times like this, and I'm here for you. Be strong. Just be strong. You don't grieve. Just be strong. Stop crying. Or the last thing we can do is just say nothing at all and be with the person. So with that said, I'm going to read this for you. Again, this is very person-centered loss. The reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal. And you will rebuild yourself around the loss that you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you be the same, nor would you want to. Not sure how much time we have for discussion, but we can entertain a bit until the room starts to fill up. Jill might have something here.
No, I just want to remind you all to please fill out your evaluations. That helps us a lot as we plan these events and is very important to us. And if you turn it in and sign a little slip, you'll be entered into a drawing for some prizes. And I want to remind you to stay in the sanctuary. We're having a closing ceremony that should be very interesting and bring the day to a close. So thank you so much. And why don't you just go ahead and talk till people come in.
Yeah. So I think what we can do, if I'm guessing, is maybe 5 minutes or so of discussion, and the room will start to fill, but I don't want to delay the rest of the program. So we have a hand here. They are not. I will chat with Tabitha about that. She was asking if the slides were online. Okay, over here. Yeah. Frozen, yeah, yeah. And do you mean as, how do you deal with a person who's frozen in anticipatory grief was the question. Do you mean as a professional supporter or as a layperson? Both? Yeah, yeah. Often as a professional supporter, I do a lot of mindfulness, a lot of bringing to the now. As a layperson, I would suggest just really maybe if it's someone you're really close with, just kind of getting eye to eye with them, because how I interpret that as a professional is that the thank you, you know what I'm trying to say, has them stuck in flight, probably, when we're speaking from a nervous system, that prepare, on alert, hypervigilance, really. And so really bringing people back into the space and now. And so if this were someone I love, I would probably say, hey, let's take a break, or what do you need right now? Really bringing them back to what's going on right now. And then as a professional, I think I would really do probably somatic practice, really getting back into the body, reminding them, is there a threat or isn't there a threat? And if there is a threat, what control do we have over it? Kind of taking a mixed response with what types of modalities I'd be drawing from. But personally, I'm a body-based somatic worker, really noticing, in my world, everything goes back to the nervous system. Hopefully, yes. This one? Or the one before? Because, okay. There we go. Sorry, that was a little rushed there at the end. Yes. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So if I could paraphrase briefly, some anger, justifiable anger, might I say, about the catchphrase, maybe we would call it, I'm sorry for your loss, especially maybe if it's someone who didn't know your person, right? It's like, well, how would you know? Yeah. And so being cautious when we use that, being very thoughtful and careful with the words that we're using. And so if, again, this were someone I know very well, I might confidently be able to say, I am so sorry for your loss. And again, it doesn't even scratch the surface for the depth of your pain, does it? So I appreciate you pointing that out. Thank you. There's Tabitha. Yep, so we're going to close up now. Thank you all. There are some books up here. I'll leave them out unless, Tabitha, would you like me to remove them? They're going to, okay. All right.